So I'd like to welcome today with me Professor Maria Castello. Her friends do call her Shirley, and she is here from the University of Turin in the Department of History to discuss something with the History of Cyprus podcast, which is very unknown. I mean, I've looked into it myself several times, and Shirley is the first person who I found had published some real work on this and in recent memory. And so I am really happy to have her on here. And listeners, when you see the title, you'll understand this is about a revolt in the 4th century that we don't really know much about. But yeah, she's here. So Shirley, thank you so much for accepting my invitation.
Thanks to you, Andreas. Really, it's a new experience for me, but I really enjoy this.
Fantastic. So the 4th century is a period of tumultuous change across the Roman Empire. Now, can you just give us some historical context just to sort of set the scene?
Yeah, the historical age we have to deal with now is the so-called late antiquity or late Roman Empire, an era whose beginning is traditionally placed with the advent to the throne of Diocletian in 284 Christian era. Trying to summarize its characteristics in a few minutes is almost impossible. So I'll only focus on some aspects that distinguish it and characterize it, or have characterized its perception in subsequent eras. Because in reality, it is not a very well-known era. Someone calls it the dark age of the Roman history. It is studied little in schools, and it is often mentioned in relation to one event, the conversion of Constantine and the so-called triumph of Christianity. It is an important aspect, but not the only one. This period presents peculiarities that make it very different from the eras that preceded, although it is to all intents and purposes part of Roman history. But what is this late empire? Well, following a perspective of political and institutional history, late antiquity is the historical era marked by a deep transformation of the political and administrative structures of the empire in a more centralized and hierarchical sense, and by a change in the conception and representation of imperial power, which becomes a sort of monarchical absolutism, to use an expression taken from modern history. This transformation was determined by the need to resolve a state of deep crisis which had characterized the 3rd century, for the resolution of which patch-ups and little adjustment were no longer sufficient. It needed a real revolution, which involved every aspect of the management of the empire: political, economical, institutional, and social. Let's start with the emperor. The emperor is no longer a princeps whose powers, at least in words, were counterbalanced by the Senate, but real dominus, a real lord. The emperor is the ultimate and sole keeper of all political and administrative powers. The officials, the office holders placed under him are nothing more than an emanation of his powers. The emperor is also placed above the laws. The emperor is dressed in an aura of sanctity, which contributes to push up his power. He's almost a semi-divine figure. And about the administrative reorganization, we can say that following needs of a strategic and administrative nature, the empire is divided into provinces entrusted to governors. These provinces were grouped together into larger structures called dioceses, ruled by officers called vicars. Those dioceses were grouped into the praetorian prefectures, entrusted to praetorian prefects. Cyprus was a province of in the Diocletianic reform, was part of the Prefectura Orientis, managed by the Prefectus Orientis or Comes Orientis, whose home was in Antiochia, in Syria. And in regard about the political aspect, the birth of the late empire was established, as we said, with the reign of Diocletian. To solve the problem of political stability and succession of powers, he created a system that would be later called tetrarchy. That is, which is a modern definition in reality. And it is not clear whether the tetrarchy was invented or created as a system or was a political system born little by little. Scholars still disagree today. We know that the tetrarchy was a system with two senior emperors, the Augusti, who were entrusted with the management of the western and the eastern part of empire. The two Augusti then selected two direct subordinates, the Caesars, who mostly had military responsibilities. The system was born above all because it was understood that the empire was too large to be ruled by a single person. But I think it's important to underline that although in essence the empire was divided, in form, its status, it remained an unicum, a whole, with only one capital, Rome. Only a few years later, a second capital was created, Constantinople, which, however, in terms of prestige, always remained second to Rome. The tetrarchy, as was conceived by Diocletian, in fact, lasted only as long as he lived. But from then to the 6th century, the empire was always ruled by at least two emperors. And it is said that Constantine destroyed the tetrarchy and proposed a monarchical form of government, therefore with a single emperor. But Constantine, and this is not clear in the literature, actually ended up replicating the tetrarchy system, but with some adjustment. Starting from 324, he became the only one Augustus, but shared the kingdom with his sons, elevated to the rank of Caesars, to whom he had entrusted the administration of different parts of his empire. Near his death, there were four Caesars: Constantine II, Constans, Constantius II, and Dalmatius, the youngest. And one of the main characters of our little history. As has been proposed, it's very likely that they would have established the imperial college after their father's death. Unfortunately, however, as often happens in the best families, conflict and jealousies between Constantine's sons changed their father's plan. Dalmatius was killed and the empire was divided between the remaining three sons. This is in this historical context, the years between 330 and 337, that the story of the Magister camelorum Calocaerus in Cyprus takes place.
And that revolt led in Cyprus by a certain, different pronunciations on his name. In modern Greek, we would say Kalokyeros. However you like to pronounce it, can you just tell us what happens? What do we know in the sources as to what the revolt is like in Cyprus?
Since it is an ancient event, an historical event, the first thing to do is go and check the sources that talk about it. That's what I did when I start my research. In this case, we are talking about really ancient sources. And the first thing to underline is the great resonance in the sources of an apparently secondary story. The rebellion of Calocaerus is incredibly well represented by sources not far from the events, such as Aurelius Victor's, but a lot of chronicles recalls this rebellion, often only with a small sentence. But this it is not important. The important thing is that the event is remembered so much during the centuries. And what do we know exactly? Aurelius Victor is an historian lived in the 4th century. Tell us that Calocaerus or Calocaerus, a Magister camelorum, tried, quindi a master of camels or dromedaries, we'll see, tried to establish a sort of personal kingdom on the island of Cyprus. Defeated, he was tortured to death, like a slave. Aurelius Victor write ex cruciatus ex servile more, as was right, evidently given his legal and social status. His social background must therefore have been modest, if not even close to a servile one. It is likely that for the crime of which he was guilty, Calocaerus had been tortured until his death. It is not mentioned who would have put down the revolt in Aurelius Victor. But immediately afterwards, Aurelius remembers without interruption the elevation of Dalmatius to the rank of Caesar. Aurelius Victor is the most complete ancient source, and also the one chronologically closest to the facts, but not the only one. Sources are really important, and for this event, there are so many, but synthetic. For the ancient world, the topic of sources, this topic is very difficult because we never possessed the original version of the ancient sources, but what is transmitted to us through copies, sometimes personalized copies, which are modified over the centuries. Furthermore, it is difficult to understand from whom the various ancient authors obtained their information, to understand the sources of our sources. In our exchange of emails, I remember you asked me, for example, about the so-called Emmansche Kaisergeschichte.
Right.
This is a real enigma. This would be a lost work written in the 4th century, in the second half of the 4th century, and it would constitute the main source for the majority of historical works written between the 4th and the beginning of the 5th century. So it's probably, I think in the Emmansche Kaisergeschichte, the revolt of Calaucer was present, I think very probably. This Kaisergeschichte, Historia Imperialis, it says existence has been hypothesized because many sources that we possess have common features, including lexical ones. But regarding the history of Calocaerus, we can divide the sources into two groups, the Latin tradition and the Greek one. Each of the two offers elements which, when combined, give us the possibility of understanding, at least in part, what happened in Cyprus in 334. Then it is the historian's job to propose an interpretation of the facts. The Latin tradition, starting from Aurelius Victor, give us the possibility of knowing the existence of a revolt in Cyprus, of knowing the name of its leader, our friend Calocaerus, and of knowing of his social status, probably not too high. This is clear from the punishment to which he was subjected, assigned according to legal sources to people of low social standing. Greek tradition adds some other information. Calocaerus had companions. His revolt did not remain limited to Cyprus. Calocaerus was defeated by Dalmatius, a relative of Constantine. The fact that the sources do not contradict each other but add informations to each other makes them reliable, and again, it is the historian's task to try to place them in a coherent context. This is
Right.
the frame of the sources.
Right. Now, you mentioned earlier that Καλόκαιρος was a Magister pecoris camelorum, which is the master of flock and camels. So what is this role exactly? And can this role tell us anything about his social standing in Cyprus? Although we do know that he was executed as a slave would be executed, but maybe his original position tells us something.
This is a crucial question, I think. Let's say, so you asked me about the characteristic of Calocaerus' rebellion and also what was his objective, his aim. So we have to understand why this story had such resonance. For understand this, it is important to understand who Calocaerus was and what his title meant. And I think it is very difficult because this title, Magister Camelorum or Magister pecoris camelorum, is a unicum in Roman history. Since the 16th century, rather imaginative hypotheses have been put forward, but they were difficult to justify on the basis of the documents. It has been proposed that it was a duke of the island or an official appointed by the emperor to provide for the reconstruction of the island after the earthquake of 332. And we talk about this earthquake later. The assignment of an official role in the imperial organization certainly came from the title of Magister or Magister attributed to him by Aurelius Victor. This title, Magister or Magister, always in the Roman administrative lexicon recall an high officer, and it could refer to an official, civil or military, engaged on the imperial Palatine service. But often this title, Magister, is given to a high-rank official, and Calocaerus was not a high-ranked official. Onomastic help very little. Based on the studies conducted by Louis Robert in the 20th century, the name Calocaerus is widely attested in the eastern area, but not associated with important officials of late age. So I think it is possible to exclude an official and look at another context and the second part of the title of Calocaerus. Magister camelorum, a figure associated with animals, especially in this case, camels of dromedaries, as it is not necessary to focus on the presence of camels on the island in Cyprus. That there were some camels, I think, is proved by the title itself attributed to Calocaerus. The real question that can help shed light on the figure of the Magister is their use. Basically, in the history of Rome, these animals were used in two contexts, military and recreational. In the first case, they served as beasts of burden responsible for transporting supplies for the troops. This role was maintained until the age of Justinian. The second use, attested since the early imperial age, is the recreational and gladiatorial field. And in this case, it is particularly suggestive due to the immediate and inevitable association with the story of Spartacus, another gladiator who fight the Roman Empire. As regards the first context, the military one, this appears unlikely. The presence of a military garrison in Cyprus in the first half of the 4th century is entirely questionable. Furthermore, the use of dromedaries and camels in the context of military campaigns was justified in mostly desert regions, and that involved long distance travel. I think specificities that were incompatible with the characteristics of the island of Cyprus. I don't know if you agree about this. On the other hand, in the military field, the title Magister is still associated with the highest rank. The second scenario appears more interesting. The scenario, the one that refers to the world of games, to which the title of Magister is traditionally associated, Magister Ludi. There is a precedent in this sense, an inscription found in Ostia near Rome, completed with an image of a camel dedicated to a prepositus camelorum of high imperial age. Most likely he was a low-profile officer responsible for the management of animals, including camels, intended for games and arenas. So my question was, can this profile fit to Calocaerus, Magister camelorum? Probably yes. Consider also the recovery of the high imperial age by the recovery of titles of the high imperial age by Constantine, and the socially low profile of Calocaerus, which can be inductively deduced for the punishment to which he was destined. This hypothesis is supported by the fact that while the presence of military contingents in Cyprus cannot be proved with certainty, the sources, archaeological sources, demonstrate the existence of gladiatorial schools on the island, in the main cities, including Salamis. This, as in any research on events in ancient history, does not constitute a proof, but a detail that allow us to propose an hypothesis. Because I think this is important. We historians do not time to reach the absolute truth, but to give plausible hypotheses based on the source we have. And confirming that Castello was not a high social class, again, is the type of punishment. But we don't know much more. For example, the origin of Castello. It is not certain that he was from Cyprus, even if some scholars believe so. And as I said, onomastic doesn't help. But this is not important to understand his rebellion. To give an example,
Yeah.
Spartacus was from Thracia, not Italian. And it must also be said that in the Roman Empire there was a lot of geographical mobility. But personally, I think Calocaerus was from Cyprus. But it's my sensation.
Yeah. Yeah, and you mentioned the nature of his death. You said he was tortured, but ultimately he was burnt to death, which was a very revealing for his social status.
Yeah, it reveals a lot about his social status, but also, as we see, the danger that his rebellion represented for the empire.
Right.
Because it was being tortured with the fire. It is called in Roman lexicon summum supplicium, and one of the worst cause of death, used to give a lesson.
Yeah.
It's very, very bad crimes.
You mentioned Spartacus, and you've drawn parallels between his revolt and the Third Servile War. You mentioned that the vocabulary of the sources echo the works of Tacitus when describing Spartacus specifically. So, can you explain what you mean exactly? Where are the parallels?
I think the lexicon is very interesting. As in the case of Spartacus, the rebellion of Spartacus, the sources for Castello speaks about a res nova. We find this Latin expression in Tacitus for Spartacus, and we find this in the sources about Castello. What is a res nova? It is an expression that refers to a subversion of the established order, to a dangerous revolt. The sources called Calocaerus demens, folle, crazy. Yeah, and the sources use this expression also for Spartacus. But these terms, demens, follies, does not indicate also an idea of crazy, but also of a mystical aura. We find this for Spartacus and for Calocaerus. Again, both of them came from a gladiatorial background. So I was interested by these coincidences. And this is again an aspect that triggered my interest. But I also think that Calocaerus and Spartacus had different aims in their revolution. I suppose we can, if you agree, we can talk about the aims of rebellion.
Yeah, I would love to know what we think his aims were, because, I mean, what did he want? Did he want to become emperor? I mean, what sort of aims could he have possibly had?
Who knows? But we can try to understand the aims of the rebellion. Leaving aside imaginative reconstruction written in past centuries, it is difficult to understand the aims. But it's true, we have a few sources. But what we can do is to understand again from what we have why a rebellion of an apparently local nature, perhaps carried out by a man who was riding the discontent following a situation of hardship, the earthquake, which had occurred a few years earlier, required the intervention of important people such as Dalmatius, relative of Constantine. It is also always important to do the right question to the historical sources. No source tells us what the mysterious Calocaerus wanted to achieve by rebelling. As we said, the episode is often reported very briefly. And in fact, the great historian Edward Gibbon had considered it to be a minor local episode. But yet, Gibbon himself mentions it. Yet, there are many sources that remember this episode. This persistence in historical memory is important and allows us to hypothesize that there was something more beyond a single line. And to understand what you need to let the sources speak, putting them together, comparing them, and adding something more from to the information they give to us. Then add what we know about the Cypriot historical context of that period. Let's start from the assumption that Calocaerus had a role in a gladiatorial school, where there were men and weapons. And let's remember that a few years before the rebellion, an earthquake had occurred, which had caused huge damages, but which were not followed by reconstruction activities. We must also pay attention to the ancient lexicon, as we have said, and the similarities, the analogies with the story of Spartacus. The sources tell us that Calocaerus had as his object the establishment of a regnum of a tyranny. The lexicon leads us to think of an attempted usurpation, as many had occurred in recent decades. What could have been the reason or the occasion that would have led Calocaerus and his companions? The sources record that he had a large following to rebel. The situation of a discontent caused by the great earthquake of a few years earlier, which was not followed by reconstruction activity. But there is also one aspect that is really interesting and raises the attention. Calocaerus, with his follower, was put to death not in Cyprus, but in Tarsus, in Cilicia, because he had been defeated there. Therefore, the rebellion was not more only local, but has spread to another region of the empire. Furthermore, the sources record many contacts between the Cyprus and Cilicia, precisely in the late ancient period. So one could hypothesize a more heterogeneous following for Calocaerus, and so that the Aetioi, the others condemned to death together with him, were much more numerous than those belonging to the Schola Ludica of Cyprus. These could also have included some Cilicians, whose membership could also have been convened by the discontent generated by a plague and consequent famine that hit the region almost in conjunction with the Cypriot earthquake. And if this reconstruction is plausible, we are dealing with a much more relevant episode than a small local rebellion. And this is confirmed by the fact that the intervention of the imperial army commanded by a member of Constantine's family was required. The Caesar Dalmatius, his nephew, and also one of the candidates for the succession of the empire. A great scholar, Glenn Bowersock, would therefore be right in saying that, and I quote, the dispatch of imperial forces under a commander from within the house of Constantine would imply that the government regarded the usurpation of Calocaerus as more than a purely local disturbance. And I really agree with him.
Yeah, that makes me wonder the people who would have supported the revolt. Do we know anything about who these people were who supported Calocaerus throughout Cyprus and Cilicia?
We have not specific sources that talk about the people who supported the Calocaerus and followed him in Tarsus. But we can assume they were gladiators or employees of the gladiator schola. We can assume there were freemen, slaves, and also Cilician, but we cannot have any information about their social status. I suppose they were low as Calocaerus, not so high in rank. But I am convinced that they were well armed, because to fight them it was needed the imperial army.
You know, and this is something I forgot to ask you, but I'm going to ask you right now. How would the revolt have looked? In other words, this particular revolt, did it include, I mean, do the sources say at all? Is it a matter of taking cities, attacking, garrisons? Like, what would the revolt have looked like? Do we know?
No, we don't know anything about the strategies, military strategies of Calocaerus and his army. We can call his companion. So we don't know about destruction of cities. We just know that the revolt ended in another region, and this is significant, I suppose. But this often happens for in ancient sources. We have very little information.
You mentioned that that this doesn't really receive the same attention as the revolt, Spartacus's revolt. And for all its, at least superficial similarities, why does it receive less historiographical attention, in your opinion?
Oh, I also asked myself this question while I was studying this rebellion. The rebellion of Spartacus had exceptional success in historiography and in reception. Not so much for whoever solved it, be it Crassus or Pompeius, but for those involved. The fact that involved the participation of an heterogeneous group of freemen, slaves, gladiator, and peasant made it to a certain level difficult to understand. So, in fact, the Romans didn't know how to define that revolt, and so they called it the Spartan revolt. Even more, the possibility of its development of an attack on the capital, Rome, played a role in the fortune it enjoyed. The rebellion of Calocaerus, although probably involving subjects who were not entirely dissimilar, was put down before it threatened real centers of power. In this case, perhaps the eastern capital or the nearest Antioch, which was more representative at the time than Constantinople. But its crossing from Cyprus to Cilicia which was not given due attention, may have foreshadowed a greater danger than what literature perceived. Hence, the incredible representation in ancient sources, which was not, however, followed by an equal historiographical fortune. There is another fact, the rapid resolution. In a few months, Spartacus challenged the empire for 3 years. The rapid resolution, moreover, by that cadet branch of the family of Constantine, which was then defeated historically and historiographically, the one headed by the Dalmatians, makes understable the marginal historiographical fortune reserved for the fair, compared to its Spartan big sister, with whom it shares a lot. But from another point of view, also considering the force put in place right from the start, it may be indicative of how much this rebellion had instead constituted a problem to be resolved in the shortest possible time. On the other hand, Constantine was able to evaluate well from direct experience the problems arising from rebellions which then led to usurpations.
I have one final question for you, and that is, for all the events in question, was there one thing that was the most intriguing for you for the Calocaerus revolt? What's the one thing that kind of stands out or that drew you to this event that we know so little about?
Thank you, because it's a great question, and it has a lot to do with the essence of my profession, of the profession of historian. Sometimes reading a small line in an ancient source triggers an interest, a curiosity that generates research. Sometimes the research leads to nothing, and you have to give up and move on. Other times, that interest opens a treasure hunt with a prize that is not only personal satisfaction, and that counts, but also understanding that an event recorded by sources is never negligible. A great historian, Lelia Cracorugini, wrote that local history is nothing other than great history placed under a magnifying glass. Minor phenomena, especially with regards to ancient history, in which the sources came to us through a long selection process, find their explanation if framed in the great history. The small history explains the big history, but vice versa, the big history cannot ignore the history considered small. So, in the case of Calocaerus, what aroused my curiosity was the position he held. I'm mainly a researcher of late Roman political institution, and for some time I wanted to understand what a Magister camelorum was. But then, as often happens, the perspective broadens from a very specific interest, and I wanted to understand something more about this history. Who Calocaerus was important, but it was more important to ask why the ancients had considered it so important. And from there began a research that perhaps returned the small, obscure employee of a gladiatorial school to the historical dimension that he deserved. I don't know, but I tried.
Shirley, this was great. Thank you so much for shedding some light into something that, it's never really received attention before, and it was really fortunate that I came across that one paper, because really it's your paper and then one that was published in the 60s, I believe. And no one else no one else has really spoken about it. I mean, I've read about it in passing. People have mentioned the revolt. Again, it's usually a footnote, but the fact that you took time and shed light onto this event, that really, if only we had some more information, we can definitely infer that this was significant for the time, considering all the things that you said, the response that was given, the fact that it spread, the context of the 4th century earthquake, the plagues that existed in Cilicia. Clearly, this was an important time, and just to get people thinking and talking about it is great. So again, Shirley, thank you so much.
Thank you to you, Andreas. I really enjoyed this experience. This research was challenging, but it was. I really enjoyed it when I studied this context, this history. So, thank you to you, really.